Salt is arguably the most important ingredient that we use in cooking. It's our seasoning and flavour enhancer, it preserves food, manages safe fermentation, can change the texture of foods, and it's one of the 5 basic tastes that we have a receptor for on our tongue. It's such a fundamental ingredient that I think I've sometimes not given it enough thought, because it's such a given that it's in every kitchen, it's used in almost every recipe, even my sweet recipes often use a small amount of salt. And then on a trip to France in the summer, I got to thinking about salt and why making my own salt had never really occurred to me before. In my cooking, I'm trying to make everything I reasonably can from scratch, so I'm distilling my own gin, I keep bees for my honey, I've made my own chef's knives, and I started wondering why I'd never given that same sort of attention to something like sea salt. And so for this video, that's what I've done, and I'm going to show you a simple way that you can make your own flaky sea salt directly from seawater. So we're going to start in one of my favourite places in France where they traditionally farm sea salt, and I promise you this is interesting and relevant, but the video will be timestamped, so if you want to just jump ahead so you can see the method for making your own sea salt, you can do that. Noirmoutier is a beautiful small island off the west coast of France, and it's one of my favourite places in the world. It's a mixture of beautiful coastlines, salt marshes and quaint French villages. I've been here camping a couple of times with my fiance, and cycling around the island is just such a great way to spend time, and of course, it being France, the food is incredible too. Living in Manchester, one of the things that I really miss is that we don't have a coastline, and always once I'm by the sea, it feels incredibly refreshing and good for the soul. And it's the sea that gives Noirmoutier a couple of its most famous products, the salt that's traditionally farmed here, and the new potatoes that they grow in the salty marsh soil. I also loved foraging wild fennel pollen from here on previous trips that grows along the side of the salt marshes. Anywhere I travel, food and flavour is the lens that I see that world through, and it can be a really good way to start to understand and get under the skin of a place too, I think. And in Noirmoutier, that starts with the fact that you're constantly cycling by these traditional salt farms, and that's what got me thinking about making my own salt to start with. So these salt farms channel seawater into these trenches, where it then gradually evaporates under the summer French sun. And as it does, the salinity of the water increases until the salt can no longer stay dissolved in the seawater and salt crystals start to form. These salt crystals are gently moved by hand by the salt farm workers and gently pulled into piles where they can further dry out. And that's the traditional method, and what I'm going to show you is basically a miniature accelerated version of this that you can do in a kitchen. So the first thing that you'll need is your seawater, and I recently went to Wales after a long hot weekend in the kitchen, and I brought with me some of the large empty containers that I normally use for the bulk storage of the gin that I make. And on the Anglesey coast I filled these up with seawater, and that's the seawater I'm going to use to make my salt. Seawater is about 3.5% salt, and we're going to recover most but not all of this salt in this process. So from 6 litres of seawater, we're going to get about 200 grams of finished flaky salt. First of all, we'll filter the seawater. Mine was completely clear, but I still pass it through a coffee filter just in case there's any tiny fragments of sand in there. Then I'm going to put my salt water in a pan, and I'm going to bring it to a boil and reduce it down to about 1/6 of its original weight. So I'll take 6 litres of salt water and reduce that down to 1 litre. We can let it boil away fairly rapidly for the first part of this reduction, but as you get closer to just having a litre left, you want to slightly slow that down and reduce the heat, and that's just so that you don't overshoot and risk slightly scorching the salt. The next stage is the gentlest stage, and we're going to put our reduced seawater into a tray and then place that in an oven or a dehydrator at 80 degrees for about 8 hours. And you could do this more rapidly, but this slower process is what's going to allow larger salt crystals to form and give us a nice flaky finished sea salt. At this stage, you'll see large salt crystals formed in the tray, and you want to gently remove them and place them in a sieve just to let any of that excess brine drain away. And then we're going to put our salt crystals back into a very low oven or dehydrator just to dry off any remaining last moisture. Again, because I'm trying to keep nice large flakes of salt crystals, I'm doing this process quite gently and quite slowly. And then at the end, there we have our finished salt made from seawater. Now, it's never going to be the most efficient thing to do this yourself, but it's a really interesting process to go through, and with a lot of things, when you go through the steps of making them from scratch, I think it can ultimately leave you better informed about the process and more thoughtful about the way you use an ingredient. If you wanted to do this in a more efficient way, you could perhaps use the residual heat from an oven after it's been hot and just put your tray of concentrated seawater in there. You might have to repeat that a couple of times over a few days and it's a little bit less controlled, but that way you're not using additional energy to make it. And then, of course, like any salt, you can use this in a variety of ways, but because you've gone to the effort of making your own salt, I would be tempted to use this or save it for things where it's going to be more noticeable as an ingredient. So perhaps using it as a finishing salt. So maybe if I had fresh salad from my raised beds, I might want to dress it and just finish it with a little bit of my own flaky sea salt, or things like salted caramel or truffles where the salt is a sort of named flavour and might even be a little bit of a finishing garnish for those things. Ultimately, you could use this in any of the ways that you normally use salt, and of course it's shelf stable and a great thing to just have on hand. It's definitely something I can imagine featuring on my menu, and it's something I'm quite keen to try using for some fermentation as well, just so I could have that sense of being involved at really every stage of that process. I'll probably also do a video soon on simple lacto fermentation, because that's something I haven't covered yet, and there again, salt is the key factor in controlling that fermentation. So do subscribe to make sure you don't miss new videos as they come out, and thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.